Eminent, credible, sustainable. A global revolution in a truly competitive millennium. Dedication and commitment are the essence in facing challenges and fulfill hopes. Intellectuals play the most significant role in the creation of frameworks for future sustainable development. This is the pledge of University Utara, Malaysia. Management is the embodiment of University Utara Malaysia UUM. Management that is based on thought and intellectual, where art, science and craft meet. At UUM, the holistic educational ecosystems is not merely to produce alumni, but to lay the foundation for future leaders.
Since its inception, UUM strives to produce graduates who are not only knowledgeable, but also thoughtful and devoted to their families and all stakeholders. With a high level of integrity, we hope that the contributions of UUM graduates to the religion, people, country, and also at the international level will bring positive impact now and also in the future.
Emphasis is given to the advancement of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, IR 4.0. The world sees UUM as an institution of higher learning, equipped with a state-of-the-art facilities, smart campus enfolded by nature. UUM champions the voice of its students. It is the voice of future intellects.
So as a student graduating, especially from University Utara Malaysia, which is actually the management university, we need to make sure that they are actually equipped with all this proficiency.
If you look at the world now, people are talking about sustainability, go green. So UM is in the right place, greeneries, and the environment is certainly very conducive to get the students to learn and to absorb knowledge.
The educational reform has placed UUM as a credible institution regionally and internationally. Humanizing education becomes our focal point, thus giving a universal value to knowledge, virtue and service. Research and innovation by its academic fraternity are undertaken with seriousness, not merely to fulfill the academic requirements, but to be at the forefront in shaping the industry. More than 100 million ringgit worth of research grants invested and more than 7,000 academic publications in the field of management and business produced in the last 5 years. Facilities and amenities provided feature the latest in smart technology, complementing the tranquility of the lush green campus surroundings. First-class infrastructures within the exquisiteness and splendor of nature showcase the education ecosystems at its best.
The facilities, the environment, actually creating individual or students who have holistic skills from the perspective of academic, professional, as well as the social skill.
We believe in developing students holistically that can serve the society and country as its future leaders with the highest integrity and professionalism.
I'm actually happy to see how exactly University of Utara Malaysia have evolved itself to become a highly ranked university.
University Utara Malaysia, over the past 3 decades, has earned its own place by providing the highest quality of education and is marching forward towards achieving greater success and greatness. With the various awards and accreditations received, the future is certain and bodes well for the university. The royal patronage with the Kedah Royal House indeed provides vital publicity for the important work done at the university and allows the enormous achievements and contributions to society be recognized.
UUM is a unique environment where the emphasis of the university is not just purely on academics. In this case, academics, sporting excellence, spiritual excellence, and by then, I guess we could live up to our motto of Ilmu Budi Bakti.
I love UUM, and I'm proud to say that I graduated from UUM.
UUM is the jewel valley of the North Malaysia.
Ilmu Budi Bakti. We love UUM.
University Utara Malaysia, the eminent management university.
Okay. Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar organized by Economics and Financial Policy Institute under the School of Economics, Finance and Banking, University Utara Malaysia. And this is our third webinar sessions, and today we will talk about rebuilding economies in the aftermath of COVID-19, OECD and non-OECD responses. My name is Shazida Jan Muhammad Khan, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. Before I introduce the panel for today's webinar, on the behalf of the Institute, we'd like to thank everyone for your support and hope that you will stay till the end of our webinar sessions. The discussion will last around 1 to 1.5 hours, and with each panel, we're given around 10 minutes to discuss and provide their opinions and ideas on the topic. And at the end of the discussion, we will open for Q&A session, basically in the third round of today's discussion. So everyone can post their questions through our Facebook Live, and we will direct your questions to the panels. Now, on regards of today's topic, it seems that the pandemic and efforts to contain it have triggered an unprecedented collapse in the economy. Now, should COVID-19 outbreak persist, should the restricted movement be extended or even reintroduced, or should be the disruption of the economy activity prolonged, what will be the condition of the economy? Is the recession going to be deeper? Now, to elaborate further on this topic, we brought to you two prominent speakers who are expert and have involved direct and indirectly in many policy discussions, and we believe they are the right people to discuss today's topic and allow us to understand and foresee what are the way forward of the economy in the aftermath of COVID-19. Now, our first panelist is Dr. Alvaro Santos Pereira, who is the Director of Country Studies and Economic Department of OECD based in Paris. Dr. Pereira also was a Minister of Economic and Employment in Portugal, in charge of major programs of economic and labor reforms. He was a professor in economic development and economic policy at Simon Fraser University in Canada, a lecturer at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and also University of York in the United Kingdom. So welcome, Dr. Pereira. Good morning to you. It's afternoon in Malaysia today. Thank you very much for being here. And,
thank you for having me.
All right. And our second panelist is our own Malaysian economist. It's Professor Dr. Joko Kwame Sundaram, who is currently served as the research advisor at Khazanah Research Institute based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He's also a visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University, and former United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. Prof. Jomo, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. And before we start, we also very privileged today to have our Dean from the School of Economic Finance and Banking, Professor Dr. Rusayani Ismail. Prof, would you like to give a few words before we begin?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Shazida. Okay, first of all, I would like to welcome both Prof. Jomo and Dr. Pereira. And thanks to both of them for their willingness to be with us today. I know that you have a very tight schedule. As mentioned by Dr. Shazida, today's forum is part of our webinar series under the Economic and Financial Policy Institute, ECOFI, under the School of Economics, Finance and Banking, UUM. Okay, through this webinar, our intention is to provide a platform for academics, students, policymakers, industries, and the community at large to share and discuss various topics related to economics and financial issues. So as we are aware, this current COVID-19 pandemic has hit the global market, weakening the international trade and cooperation, which in turn had huge impact on the global value chain. So as opposed to globalization, we can actually see there is a tendency toward protectionism and nationalism. So on the other word, we see this what we call as the economic distancing. And this will surely affect the economic welfare around the world. So what do we do? What are some of the policy options that we have? Are the measures that each country take will eventually help the world back to be on track, or do we need a more concerted effort? So perhaps these are some of the issues that will be deliberated today, and I hope that the deliberation by both panelists will shed light on the important matters concerning the policy measures to rebuild the economy post-COVID-19. Last but not least, many thanks again to both Prof. Jomo and Dr. Pereira and the rest of the participants who are following this forum through our FB Live. Hope everybody will have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yani. Now, to the audience and also to both our panelists, as mentioned by our Prof. Yani, today we will concentrate more on the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy. And as we go along, we know that WHO have declared the COVID-19 as the World Health Emergency in January 2020. And since then, the emergency has evolved into a global public health, and most of all, it become an economic crisis that have affected more than 19 trillion US dollar globally in the economy, beyond anything that ever experienced in a century. Okay, and then the lockdown measures brought in the most governments have succeeded in slowing down the spread of the virus, reducing the death and also the spread of the virus. But then at the same time, it have another effect on the economy. It have frozen business activities in many sectors. It's widened the inequality, disrupted educations, and also undermined confidence in the future. So as the restriction begin to ease, the path of economy recovery remains highly uncertain and vulnerable, and we are looking the possibility of second wave of this infection. Okay, so it shows that every region now subject to a substantial economy downgrade. Efforts to reduce social interactions to contain the spread of the virus disrupt the daily life and also adding up to the economic cost. Now, Prof. Jomo, can you comment on this? How can we have the balance? Because we are in the middle now. It's either we are controlling the spread of the virus, but at the same time, we're also facing the economic cost on this situation. How would you look on this matter?
Well, thank you very much for this invitation to participate with Mr. Pereira. I think we have a very difficult situation for three reasons. Firstly, we have, of course, an unprecedented pandemic, which has had a very high infection rate in the parts of the world where the infections have spread.
Yes.
And there has been a slow understanding of the nature of the pandemic and continued difficulties in dealing with the pandemic. Related to that, of course, is the fact that there are a number of companies and countries which have taken, which are seeking to take political and economic advantage of this pandemic by posing the issues in particular ways and also attempting to have control over the supply of tests, the supply of treatments, the supply of vaccines, and so on and so forth. This will obviously have very important implications for the future of intellectual property rights and understanding of intellectual property rights, as more and more countries, the poorer countries, the vulnerable countries, their access to public health, the ability of authorities concerned to respect with respect to public health emergencies have been undermined by these laws. Secondly, I think it is very important to recognize that this crisis has unfolded partly through acts of omission and acts of commission. Acts of omission in the sense that we have seen a failure of action, in much of the world. The crisis, of course, the virus is currently believed to have started at the end of 2019.
Yes, December.
And to
2019.
Spread, particularly in China, first month of this year.
Yeah.
Now, what has happened is that many countries, including China, have embarked on a range of precautionary early actions. This was true in the provinces of China outside of the 3 provinces surrounding Wuhan city, which is in the industrial hub. The 3 provinces, workers from in Wuhan came from all 3 provinces, and this was quite important. But in the remaining provinces of China, there has not been stay-in-shelter lockdowns because of early precautionary actions. In Japan, in Taiwan, in the Republic of Korea or South Korea, likewise. Even in Vietnam, there have not been national stay-in-shelter lockdowns, although there has been stay-in-shelter lockdowns in particular communes of Vietnam. And we find the same thing has happened in Kerala state in southwestern India. Unfortunately, in the rest of the world, not enough precautionary early action measures were taken, and has led to the need to impose stay-in-shelter lockdown measures. And this, of course, has had tremendous effects in terms of the decline in output, decline in economic activity, and decline, and most importantly, for most of the world, decline in livelihoods. Most of the people in the world outside of the OECD economies are actually work in what is broadly termed the informal sector. And, their livelihoods have been shattered by many of the stay-in-shelter lockdown measures which have been introduced. The third problem, of course, has been the problem of how governments have responded. Otherwise, I've already mentioned the stay-in-shelter lockdown measures, but otherwise, we have seen the tendency of some governments to see this as simply yet another financial crisis after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, or earlier financial crisis which hit our part of the world in East Asia. So this tendency to see it in terms of the range of possible measures has limited and constrained government actions which are very much needed. There were some early voices, notably the 2 French economists at the University of California, Berkeley, Saiz and Zuckman, who emphasized the importance of dealing with liquidity issues which are not simply going to be affected by simply lowering interest rates, for example. Ensuring that there are enough incomes for people. In the OECD economies, it's much easier because we are talking about ensuring at least a large fraction of the wage continues to be paid, and so on and so forth. But for the rest of the world, other measures are desperately needed, especially for those who are self-employed, petty businesses, as well as those who are daily rated workers who do not earn anything if they do not work. And so, these people have been especially hard hit in urban areas, and much of the world's population is now caught in urban areas. Now, these, I think, have been the 3 principal problems. Of course, we have been, there's a lot of talk about the decline in trade, but I think it's important for us to recognize that the decline in trade actually began with the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and been a significant increase in trade in over a decade. So the decline in trade is particularly worrying it basically reminds us that the global supply chains, which were developed over the last 3 decades or 4 decades of trade liberalization and so on, are unlikely to continue, unlikely to be available. And these are not simply because they are necessitated by economic conditions. Both the United States and Japan have urged their companies to withdraw from investments and other activities in China. And this, of course, and these supply chains are no longer simply within China. They are regional, if not global. And so countries in Southeast Asia, even Bangladesh and so on and so forth, will be very, very much affected by this. So we have a crisis which has been bad enough, but which has been worsened by the fact that very inappropriate policy responses have resulted in a suboptimum response to the crisis. Let me stop there. Thank you.
All right. It seems that the constraint and the stress is more for the developing countries, Prof. Jomo, because there are many more countries that already fall under very big distress before the pandemic happened due to the uncertainty of the economy and also the global economy in 2007-2008. Now, for Dr. Pereira, how does these OECD countries' reactions on their trends of actions towards reviving the economy? I'm sure it's quite different, as Prof. Jomo has mentioned, the scenario in the OECD country compared to on the non-OECD countries.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and I should say that I subscribe completely what Professor Jomo just said, and so follow up from there. We follow not only OECD countries, we follow countries from India, we follow Malaysia, Thailand, and so on and so on. So we follow more than OECD countries. But I'll try to give you a perspective of the difference of policy response, and I think at the end I'll talk more about the MEs, which I really think the big impact of the crisis is going to be on the most vulnerable households, but also on the most vulnerable countries, such as the MEs. But I think the big characteristic of this crisis is the pervasive uncertainty. We don't know what will happen in the next few months. We don't know what will happen in the next years. And this is what is also taxing investment and consumption, and also even policy responses. We know that in the past, these pandemics have happened. We know that the last one was 1919 to 1920. It lasted almost 3 years. And it came in waves. We came in the first wave in spring 1919, then came in the Northern Hemisphere. Then it came in the fall, and then it came in 1919, and so on and so on. But it changed. Virus mutated. It changed around the world. So preventing uncertainties, I think, is key for us to understand the crisis. Secondly, this is for economists, this is a supply shock and a demand shock. So usually we have either financial crisis and we have only either a demand shock or a supply shock. Here we have both. And so this is partly the difference from previous crises, that right now probably 90% of the countries in which they will have a lower income per capita, and this will have substantial implications for the countries in terms of consumption, investment, and policies as well. Thirdly, I think Professor Jomo said very eloquently that what characterizes in terms of policy response is that many Asian countries were a lot more prepared than the rest of the world, partly because of SARS and partly because of what happened in recent past with different epidemics or possible epidemics. And because of that, I think the first reaction was much more positive than many other countries, like in Europe and Latin America and other parts of the world with strict lockdowns. However, because of the role of trade, including in your own region, trade is so important for countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and many others, that the lockdowns in many other countries also affected dramatically the economies in your own country. So in spite of being much more prepared than other parts of the world, the economic impact is very large. In fact, what we see even in the OECD economies, countries like Sweden that, for example, decided not to go to strict lockdown, they face almost as a fall in GDP as much as many countries that go to strict lockdown. So because of the impact in trade and because of the impact of the rest of the economy. Also very important to say that another characteristic, I'll go back to the policy response in a second, but another characteristic is the impact on vulnerable workers. We know that the workers that have been more affected right now are the low-paid, unskilled,
Yes, it's true.
temporary workers, informal, as Professor Jomo, the informal workers have been extremely impacted by the crisis, and also the young people, because young people, especially when they get out of university or get out of school, they are trying to get their job. If you get a major recession ahead of them, they will face substantial problems to find a job.
Yes.
And so disproportionately, this crisis is already affecting young people much more than the other. In policy responses, so OECD countries and non-OECD countries, we follow, as I said, many countries from OECD and non-OECD, and policy response were were in many ways similar. Monetary policy became much more accommodative, so basically interest rates fell and there was additional liquidity in the economy. Fiscal policy became also very responsive, so almost everybody, even in countries that were very concerned about fiscal rules and lower deficits and so on, everybody knows that the priority right now is health, and so right now we need to help the economy in terms of health first, deal with the sanitary crisis, then obviously try to deal with the economic crisis and social crisis. And so everybody right now is not fixed on the fiscal impact. It's mostly fixed basically right now. Stop the bleeding fire with the crisis. I think this is quite important. But as I said, OECD countries, as Professor Jomo was emphasizing, it utilized a lot of short time work schemes. So basically not firing people and the state paying for at least part of their wages, or if not all, trying to give liquidity to firms, try to stop, as I said, the bleeding of the economy right now. But increasingly, you can see that, countries are moving from emergency to try to stabilize the economy right now. And then in 4 or 5 months, almost likely, the policy will gear towards unemployment, trying to put people back to work, but also try to get incentives to fight unemployment. But the other issue that is going to be a big issue in the next few months will be insolvency. Right now, if unemployment is starting to fall, we know that in many countries, because of the impact in many sectors like tourism and many others, very likely there will be a rise in insolvency in the next few months. So both in OECD and non-OECD countries, you will start seeing not only insolvency measures or measures to fight insolvencies, like insolvency regimes and so on, but also you will find other type of measures to help out with the situation. I just want to finish, and then we can talk more about policy. But I just want to finish about to say something that I think is crucial, which is this crisis. Besides the vulnerable workers, the big impact is going to be on emerging markets. One of the big consequences of the crisis is going to be a big rise in public debt. But we know that both public debt and corporate debt was rising already dramatically, even before this crisis. Like the World Bank had published a major report recently before COVID on global waves of debt. And this is exactly what we're facing. We are facing many economies highly indebted, both in terms of public policy and public debt and corporate debt. And on top of this, right now we have a major hit like COVID, and this will lead to a bigger rise in public debt and corporate debt. So this will affect disproportionately the emerging market economies. And as a consequence, I personally think that we are going to witness in the next few months and next few years, especially, a return to very large number of defaults of many countries and debt restructuring. And so I think volatility will be the name of the game going forward. I'll stop here and then we can talk more about it.
Okay, it sounds very worrying, but that's the fact. Because of the COVID-19, so many things has been happening, and the disruption is not small. It's getting severe. Every time there's a news, you can listen, and it become very severe at every time. But then, Prof. Jomo, do you think the economy has a prospect of going into stagflation? Do we need to worry in the coming months? If yes, what is the implication? What should we do? What are the actions that can we take to face what's coming? As Dr. Paira mentioned, we cannot know what's going to happen, but just what can we do? What can we plan at the moment?
Well, many people would claim that there is already stagflation right now, in the sense that prices are going up while economic stagnation. But of course, the very nature of this crisis is such that once people are allowed to go back to work, that you will have, in a sense, what might appear to be the beginnings of a V-shaped recovery. The big problem, of course, as Dr. Pereira has emphasized, is what happens after that. How do we ensure that this is sustained? And very much depends on the nature of businesses in particular economies. If some economies are not able to move forward, and while other economies are able to move forward, let me give you an example which comes out of the response earlier. You have different bankruptcy legislation. In the United States, for example, the bankruptcy law allows companies to declare bankruptcy and then to be able to continue to operate, to take on new loans as necessary, and so on and so forth. This is very important in terms of keeping an economy going. In the case of many other countries, unfortunately, we have these very old types of bankruptcy laws, which basically kill economies. Now, this is a very extraordinary situation. You cannot start changing legislation in the middle of a crisis for a whole variety of reasons. But what you can do is to introduce emergency legislation which ensures that some of the liquidity problems which enterprises are facing, and I'm particularly concerned with the smaller and enterprises. I've had the pleasure of visiting Portugal and some other, and I lived in Southern Europe for a little while, and there you see that the so-called informal sector is actually is actually quite significant. It's not like in Northern Europe and so on. So and some of the other OECD economies. So we see a variety of situations. And so there's no simple one-size-fits-all solution to these many problems. But I think what is important is enabling the resumption of economic activities once you are able to get out of the stay-in-shelter lockdowns. The problem, one of the big problems, is how do we handle the stay-in-shelter lockdowns? Especially for large economies, but even for a relatively small economy like Malaysia, necessary to have stay-in-shelter lockdowns throughout the country, or could the stay-in-shelter lockdowns have been focused on particular areas which are much more, which had higher rates of infection and so on? It's basically what happened in China around Wuhan and the 3 surrounding provinces. We need much. We always talk about targeting, but when it comes and it becomes a means of exclusion rather than inclusion. But when we need targeting, as in this, so we have very blunt instruments, when this need not be necessary. One of the fortunate things about many of the poorest countries in the world is that there are very few people who have been infected who travel to those countries. And so these countries have been spared. A country like Chad, Niger, and so on and so forth, nobody visits them, even under normal circumstances. So that is the only thing which has been protecting them, that they have been marginalized in the world economy. But they, of course, have had their own sets of problems with Ebola and so on as in the past. So there is no one-size-fits-all. There are certain things which obviously need to be done at the global level. And those precautionary measures, which were important, which were very successful in East Asia and in Kerala and so on, many of them will still need to be taken. How do we, about physical distancing, about face protection, particularly masks, and also increasingly the use of shields, and so on and so forth. There are a whole range of measures which need to be taken, and there needs to be an all-of-government approaches. How do we reorganize, say, public transportation? How do we reorganize the workspace in workplaces to minimize the possibility of infection even after you come back into? Because all you need is a couple of cases and to get through the cracks, and then you can have a full-blown resurgence of the epidemic. So I think we need to it's very, very difficult as Dr. Pereira has to deal with all the OECD countries, which are so different. I mean, you look, for example, at a country like New Zealand, okay, exemplary a country like New Zealand. Contrast that with other countries, where say Sweden, for example, which thinks that it's developing herd immunity. Obviously, it's not easy for him to give one simple prescription which is relevant to everybody else. And the developing world is not very different.
Yeah.
We have to be much, much more, targeted. And this is why whatever expertise we have needs to be shared. There are very few incentives to learn from each other, to share with each other.
Great. Yeah.
We have an approach of everybody for themselves.
Yeah.
I think we are going to have, unfortunately, we are going to be our own greatest enemies. So this is a time for solidarity. This is a time for multilateralism. This is a time for international cooperation and so on. And I unfortunately, it is in such short supply. Instead, it's being distracted by pointing fingers and blame games and so on and so forth.
I agree with the collaboration, the integrations among states and also countries in finding ways to combat this COVID-19. But Dr. Pereira, what could go wrong along the way in planning to revive the economy? What could go wrong that could we going to face in a few months' time?
I think many things could go wrong, especially just to give you an idea, as I go to the idea of pervasive uncertainty. For the first time ever, the OECD has been doing economic for more than 60 years. For the first time ever, in the last economic outlook that we launched in mid-June, we had two scenarios, right? So instead of having one central scenario and then having risks associated with the scenario, we had two scenarios. And this is mostly basically related to the uncertainty that we don't know if the virus, there's the recovery, and then it will not be certainly in V, at least in most countries, because it's taking too long and many sectors are being affected. Even today, we had new data coming out of China, was not so exciting. It was better, but not great. And as you know, it should be early in the recovery right now. But because we don't know if the virus will come back later in the year or even next year, we decided to have two scenarios. One with a kind of a prolonged recovery, but not a very fast one, and the other one in which the virus comes back in a second wave later in the year. And this will not just lockdowns, but will lead to either regional lockdowns or at least some restrictions along the way. And this will lead to an economic impact. So basically, what could go wrong is partly, the virus does not go away. We don't find a vaccine or an effective treatment so soon, and the pervasive uncertainty continues. We continue to shut down parts of the economy. I think going to strict lockdowns in most countries would be politically unfeasible. Also, socially, it might be a disaster because, as I said, after you have 1 or 2 or 3 months of lockdown in many countries, which is already affecting dramatically a lot of sectors and a lot of people. If we have another wave of lockdowns, then this will be the end for many businesses, the end for an extremely serious situation for many families. And so I think a lot of things can go wrong, and so we need to be better prepared than we were in the first wave. Even in Southeast Asia, that they've been much better prepared than almost everybody else, have to be prepared and do not be complacent. I give an go back to the example of the pandemic in 1918. Australia, in the pandemic of 1918, was not affected by the first wave. And so they thought, because they locked down the country, they not everybody in, they did not let anybody in, and so on and so on. And so they relaxed then afterwards. And when they relaxed, then the virus, entered Australia, and it hit with a vengeance. There was a substantial number of casualties there. So do not be complacent. And we're starting to see this in many, many countries. In countries like Costa Rica, countries like Chile that did very well at first. They prepared very well. And now suddenly a massive increase in the number of cases. So do not be complacent so that things don't go dramatically wrong. So, this is part of the story. The second thing, as I said, expect the recovery almost likely will be protracted unless we find a vaccine. If we find a vaccine and we start having, and I agree with Professor Jomo, this has to be, if we find a vaccine or an effective treatment, we need to treat it as a common good. This has to be a common good and a public good for the whole of humanity. It cannot be, and I think multilateralism has to play a role here. I think this for us is crucial, I think. But I think it's very possible that the recovery will be protracted and might, as I said, we might have some setbacks along the way. I would like also to highlight the issue that Professor Jomo was talking, which is the insolvency issue, which, as I said before as well, this will be a big topic down the line. And many countries are not ready. So they do not have insolvency regime fast enough to recover, and to, whenever they can, do reforms, and also introduce out-of-court procedures and so on to help companies restructure. But another thing that I think is quite important, this crisis has led such an overwhelming increase in unemployment in parts of the world, say the United States, and also a big rise in insolvencies, that even very efficient countries or countries with very efficient insolvency regimes, such as the United States, might be overwhelmed by the number of insolvencies that we'll be facing. So it's more or less like when we talk about the health sector, we know that many developed countries have very good health sectors, but they were not ready for the overwhelming number of cases and serious cases that ended up in the intensive care units, and so they had to expand the supply. But even so, that will not be enough to face part of the problem. The same thing could happen with the insolvencies. If the insolvencies really rise as we expect in many countries, many court justice systems will not be ready, even if they might be extremely, will not be ready to deal with all this. And so this is something that will, again, the scale is unprecedented. And so we might be facing some big consequences. Probably I could stop here, and then we can talk about a little bit more about the role of the government in the economy.
I think insolvency will be a big issue in coming months. I think there should be more discussion on these matters. Now, I want to come back to Prof. Jomo. I want to come back to Southeast Asia for a while. Okay, for example, I want to talk about the government, how the government now, how the government act will be shaping the interest economy. Now, when it comes to Southeast Asia, Prof. Jomo, for example, policy interventions aim to address this pandemic across the developing world. And among others, money has been allocated in order to cover we use this as an immediate expenses related to this pandemic. And for example, Malaysia, for example, we spent almost 290 billion, which is cost around $67 USD. Okay, and it's quite worrying number because of this huge amount of money has been allocated just to ensure the economy is moving. So based on this initiative, how would you think? Do you think this will also affect the fiscal health of this government? And then do you think, as you mentioned earlier, there should be a collaboration? Do you think locally, domestic, the country itself interactions between the NGOs, the private sector, should they be given more intensive roles in helping and facing the COVID-19 economy?
One of the biggest problems which is standing in the face of recovery are people who are insisting on fiscal balancing, on fiscal consolidation at this time. This is very, very unfortunate. This is an extraordinary circumstance. If you go by the usual fiscal expectations of fiscal balancing and so on and so forth, you are basically tying your hand behind your back, even in a situation where you need everything possible, and this is what is desperately needed. Now, there is no such thing as a Southeast Asian response. The different countries have responded very differently, partly reflecting their different means and so on and so forth. What has happened in Malaysia? You mentioned the figure of 290 billion. In fact, most of it are so-called monetary measures. Only 10% of it are fiscal measures. And even the fiscal measures were not well targeted, in my view. If you think, for example, of increasing the incomes of civil servants and ignoring the needs of the informal sector, ignoring the needs of the daily rated workers, and so on and so forth. This, I think, is very, very inappropriate. Increasing these measures should have been better targeted to identify and ease the pain which are felt by the most vulnerable groups. Now, it is probably not possible to save everything. I think, for example, that for quite some time to come, public hospitality events, hospitality businesses are not going to go anywhere. They're going to go south. There's almost no way to prevent that. So we need what is needed for those businesses which are going to go south. It will be very, very different from those businesses which are likely to expand. For example, there is likely to be far greater concern and interest not only in healthcare but also in care in general. There will be far more need for this. There's a need to redeploy people who will be dislocated from those declining industries, those sunset industries, if you will, and try to reallocate them. And these are not painless. These are going to cost money. This is going to involve retraining, while ensuring that they have a basic incomes to be able to sustain demand. If aggregate demand collapses completely, that can be disastrous. And Malaysia, of course, is a very, very open economy. But when we think about basic needs, most basic needs are actually produced within the Malaysian economy. When you think about international trade, international demand, how much is demanded by the rest of the Southeast Asian region? Very little. We do a lot of trading, perhaps through Singapore and so on. But other than that, there is very little. So we have to read and understand our trade statistics and so on much better in order to have much more effective targeted measures. Now, so I am frankly very, very upset with the amount of attention being given by the press to the the financial doomsayers. All predicting doom if you go into debt and so on. Now, if just think about World War II, if Britain did not take a borrow using wartime bonds, or the US did not borrow, do you think that the war would have been concluded the way it was concluded? Obviously not. So we need to begin to recognize that this is a very extraordinary black swan event, and we need to respond to it as effectively as we can in the course of things. I think having pointed out that most of the measures have actually been so-called monetary measures. If you look at the take-up rate, many of the monetary on offer were not taken up.
Yes.
And the number of measures and the number of businesses and individuals who have benefited from them are actually very, very few. We're talking about less than 2%. Okay, 2% of businesses, of SMEs, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises, have actually taken advantage of the measures on offer. So I think we should not we should recognize that you need a much more sophisticated, just moving the interest rate down and so on and so forth is just not good enough because of the very specific nature of this crisis, and you need to be able to tailor your measures accordingly.
Dr. Pereira, do you want to comment on the same issues here? Do you think we should have, because the informal sector for Malaysia, when we talk about the SME especially, these informal sectors are among that being distressful sectors, they were somehow being impacted, somehow left into their own way of dealing with the situation. Do you have any comment on this?
Well, I certainly agree with Professor Jomo that countries like Malaysia, you have fiscal room, right? So in order to deal with the issues, some other countries don't have fiscal room, and they even so they have to spend at least on health and partly to support the economy. But Malaysia still has fiscal room, and certainly this is not the time to dwell too much on whether or not they should. Should you support only the health sector, or should you support the informals and so on? I think you need to do both. So I think it's very important that you protect the vulnerable families, and right now, stop the potential substantial problems that you might have down the line of people getting losing their livelihoods and not being able to get a decent living. So I think this is certainly true. I think it's also important to say that very likely, not now, but in the 6 months time, 1 year, depending on how long the crisis will last, it's very important that Malaysia, in the recovery stage, you start focusing on something that I think is quite important. And we highlighted in the last economic survey of Malaysia, which is, you've progressed dramatically. I think you are one of the countries that impressed me the most in the last few decades in terms of economic progress. But for me, what was striking when I went back and started reading what my team was writing about Malaysia and their analysis was the part on skills or education. You have a part of your population with skills are still not adequate for a very well-off economy like Malaysia, with a lot of multinationals as well there. And so investing more and especially focusing on improving your education performance and skills, I think, will be quite important. And so this ties basically to what I think I wanted to say is that, you postpone already the approval of the next development plan. For me, when I go to Malaysia, something that impressed me the most is that I've never seen any country that plans as much as you do, for good and bad. But you plan, you have blueprints and master plans for almost everything. But it's very important. The next one is going to be a key one, because it's going to be the one on the recovery. So to start thinking, how can you first support the vulnerable and save that are good and viable, support and making that the informal that you have become more formal if possible. How can you decrease informality as well? But also, I think, what is the next wave of reform that Malaysia needs in order to continue the incredible development progress that we had in the last few decades? So I think this is key. As Professor Jomo is saying, liquidity support, monetary support is not going to be enough. You are going to need to spend some money in investing in education and skills. and also in infrastructure, especially for the, as I said, and to support the vulnerable. But you need to also think, what can you do in terms of preparing the Malaysian economy for the next waves of development, in terms of digital and in terms of skills? I think this is going to be key. And so the next development plan, I think, should be the one where you think about the next wave of reform so that Malaysia continues to grow.
You mentioned about digital, going into digital. Do you think going into digital economy can give some cushion to what's happening now in the coming months and years? Do you think it should have a tremendous change as we have the conversation now?
Yeah, well, certainly. Listen, I think one of the silver linings, probably the big silver lining of this crisis, is that this crisis forced us and accelerated dramatically the digital transition. Right. So, you know, I don't know if it was 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, but certainly we are. This seminar is a proof of that.
Yes.
Right now to go through our digital channels than before. And so I think this will change the way that we work. Telework will become much more pervasive. And I think we are going to change dramatically the ways that we work. And so in the next few years, I think this is going to be the big transformation, or one of the big transformations we're witnessing. But also, I think what this crisis is showing, that there is a huge digital divide. All of us in this group and many people outside this group, right? So people still don't have computers at home. Yeah. Many people have access to internet at home. So, you know, even for kids in primary schools, very often, you know, many kids, especially from poorer backgrounds, do not have access, were not able to continue their class because they could not do online classes. So the divide is very stark. And so this crisis also shows that, you know, governments need to address this digital divide. It's just not feasible to have two dual economies in which you know, society has all this digital infrastructure and other parts of the economy don't have. But I should say, just to end up, that this is a challenge not only for many emerging markets and developing countries, but also for very advanced economies. I'll give an example. Germany is not well prepared in terms of digital infrastructure. The OECD has been saying this for years and years and years. They need to invest in digital infrastructure, especially in the rural side of their economy. But still, I think the big thing they're going to do is exactly, they've noticed that this crisis is a big opportunity for them to invest heavily in this area. And countries will have to do the same thing. So, as I said, I think digital is going to be a big issue. But for that, also, you need to address the inequalities that exist in terms of digital divide.
It seems that the COVID-19 is a wake-up call to all of us in many sectors, you know, the health sector, the economy, and then the rest of the people, the life of ourselves, you know, the new normal we are talking about. Now, when we go back to the regional, okay, we know that global response has been largely absent in addressing the unprecedented crisis. If we look at United Nations, for example, United Nations Security Council also has been condemned for their failing to even put forth a resolution for the COVID-19. Even the World Health Organization also has been criticized, maybe because of their they also have limited regulatory authority, you know, so they've been criticized for that. Even some of the Western governments we see also have before this have traditionally shown leadership, okay, on responses to pandemics. Also been looked into very occupied. They are only trying to address the threat inside their national borders. Okay, so by looking into this situation now, Pro Jomo, do you think this is the time for these regional organizations come together and bridge this gap? You know, I mean, to give responses, to give sustain to the health issues and also related supply chains and also the failed global multilateral responses.
Everybody would agree that the most successful and developed regional organization is the European Union. And I think we also know the limited role of the European Union in response to this crisis. ASEAN is way behind in terms of the level of economic integration, the level of policy coordination, and so on. I think it is a shame that there isn't a greater degree of regional cooperation and so on. That is the reality. So you don't go looking for, in the middle of a crisis, trying to create regional cooperation. I think it's very unfortunate is that the links which were not more effectively made. For example, in terms of tracking the cross-country spread of the virus, the famous Tabligh cluster from in Malaysia at the end of February spread the virus to at least 6 different other countries in ASEAN and a couple of other countries in South Asia. And then we have con men, confidence tricksters who have been selling bogus equipment, bogus masks, bogus treatments. I mean, look at the health minister of Malaysia who announced that you drink warm water and that will kill the virus. And he didn't. He might be a medical doctor, but where did that idea come from? He got it from somebody who advised him. I mean, who are these people who are advising ministers, without any kind of scientific authority? Another country, I think Indonesia, ordered 2 million treatments of, and was very confident that it could deal with the crisis because it had ordered 2 million of a particular thing, which now it turns out is not a appropriate treatment. So we have a lot of opportunistic business people who have been using the crisis for their own advantage, and also, of course, politicians who have used the crisis for their own advantage. And this has made the dealing with the crisis all the more difficult. But as far as trying to use this to build regional solidarity or depending on regional cooperation, I'm afraid the track record has not been better. We could have learned from a relatively poor country in the region. Vietnam has relatively well, not a single death so far, even though they were one of the first countries to be infected because there were workers who returned to Vietnam during the Lunar New Year from Wuhan. And yet they were able to deal with it. In the case of Kerala, although it's again a very poor state in southwest India, they were able to deal with it by taking very effective measures and particularly in the case of Kerala, to deal with particularly the most vulnerable sectors of the population. Very exemplary. How many people are prepared to learn from a relatively poor country like Kerala or relatively poor economy like Vietnam? So we instead of looking even to Northeast Asia, okay, to Japan, to Korea, to Taiwan, and so on, we were looking elsewhere, and ended up almost getting into very, very serious trouble. And the thing which changed policy in Malaysia was the Imperial College of London study, which changed policy in the UK. I mean,
sorry to interject, but we know there's some meetings, by ASEAN and also at the SARC in February. So it seems that something is going on. Can we expect something incoming from these 2 meetings been happening between ASEAN countries?
The fact that you have not heard anything happening.
Not yet for now.
Okay. I mean, you should ask the foreign minister that or whoever attended those meetings. But unfortunately, there has been some cooperation. Let me not, the cooperation between Singapore and Malaysia in some areas has been important. But the way we have treated migrant workers is reprehensible. It is shameful. We have 2/3 of foreign workers in Malaysia are undocumented, and we have been so ready to blame them for all our problems in a way which is very embarrassing. I think what countries like Portugal have done actually has been quite commendable in the face of the kind of foreign sentiment which has unfortunately grown in the wake of the crisis. It is all too easy to blame foreigners for problems. I think the fact that we are quite happy to take advantage of these foreign workers during the good times is a problem. I think Dr. Pereira highlighted, the fact that we have not done enough for human resource development. Malaysia has been deindustrializing since the turn of the Asian financial crisis. Where is future growth going to come from? All so ready to talk about the fourth industrial revolution and all these nice slogans, but we have to. Those things are not going to happen spontaneously. We have to create the enabling conditions for that. And this is a big challenge which we need to face together. So my own view is that we don't go status quo ante. When we talk about rebuilding, we're not talking about going back to what existed before this crisis. What we need to do is to not to let this crisis go to waste, if I can be slightly cynical about it. We have to learn lessons from this and learn lessons which are to rebuild this nation and to rebuild this world on a much more stronger basis, a much more on the basis of greater solidarity across communities, both national as well as internationally.
So, Dr. Pereira, do you agree that the choice that we had now in facing COVID-19 is both together to work on our shared interests, to work the collaboration based on shared interests, on education, on respect, support to the need, together with the short-term interests that will only lead to the building up net crisis to reduce the capacity to cope within the country. That means we cannot work alone. At the same time, we have to work together and to address specific and focusing on who really need at this moment. How would you comment on the situation of this reversal of globalization production change, the bad news for developing countries? How would you see on this matter?
So, I would like to add to what Professor Jomo was saying. I agree with him regarding ASEAN. I think that's, for me, that's fairly obvious. With the European Union, I should say, just to go back to the regional organization, I'll get back to your answer to your question. With the European Union, I think this is kind of a make or break type of crisis for the European Union, because the European Union just had a crisis very recently, and everybody, I think, a lot of people in the European Union believe that this is time to show that this is different. The policy response last time around was not so good, right? So it was austerity and a lot of blame games, especially to countries that behave irresponsibly. The policy response this time around has been a lot more positive. The European Union, first of all, we have the ECB, the European Central Bank, that open up the taps rather than closing them like they did last time around. Easing the requirements. The same thing with the Commission. They ease the requirements on fiscal deficits. They on state aid. And now the proof will be in the pudding. Perhaps this weekend, because this weekend there's a big meeting with the European leaders, and perhaps there'll be a big recovery fund to help the countries most in need. This is not enough because obviously the European Union is not a federal state, and so the national budgets will have to participate. But I think solidarity coming from the European Union would be a good example for the rest of the world in terms of how can we also help ourselves. I also like to add that I do think and totally agree that the answer, especially for the health crisis, has to be more solidarity between us and not starting to play our selfish games, because this is a health crisis that affects everybody. It doesn't matter our religion, it doesn't matter where we come from, it doesn't matter where we live. Everyone is affected. We're all humans. We are all affected by this virus. And so I think it's very important that if we find an effective treatment, if we find a vaccine, we need to find ways that everybody should have access to them. as soon as possible. Okay. And finally, to go back to your question regarding GVCs, I think GVCs, global value chains, are going to be changed fairly dramatically going forward. They were already, so protectionism was already on the rise, but I think more and more you'll see that it's not feasible for, especially for big multinationals, to have critical production. It doesn't matter if it is medicine or cars, critical productions for their own products in only in one country. So I think what you're going to see, many of them will get out of China, many of them will stay in China, but this will also be a good opportunity for countries like Malaysia and other countries in which if multinationals start looking for other locations for their part of their production, this could be a good opportunity to attract these type of firms. But I do think global value chains will be substantially affected. I think this is going to be one of the big impacts of the crisis. And I think in 5-10 years' time, we'll understand better what will happen to this. But globalization was, unfortunately, already on the retreat. I think this would be a good opportunity to say, okay, it's time to go back to see if we can resume globalization, perhaps in a different type of ways and with some changed rules. But I'm afraid that this might not happen. I think, unfortunately, I think it is very possible that we'll continue to see protectionism a little bit more on the rise, which is not good news for countries like Malaysia and others that are so open. But a response of Malaysia and other countries in the region might be, not now, but in a bit later, then to try to develop more regional agreements, to try to continue to have foster trade and so on. As I said, the crucial bit right now is going to be, okay, how can we get out of this and how can we recover?
Yes.
And until we deal with the health emergency and we have an effective treatment, this might not be possible.
Yeah. It seems that I've got a lot of questions coming in through our Facebook Live. I will select few. Okay. One of it is coming from Associate Professor Dr. Anggapan. He's one of the senior lecturers in University of Malaysia. Now, any of the panelists would like to answer this will be welcome. So he's asking, are countries becoming more inward-looking, defensive, nationalistic in their economic policy responses? Is this the right way going forward? Prof. Jomo, do you want to comment on this? Or maybe Dr. Pereira yourself?
Well, Dr. Pereira is the one who monitors this all over the world. I'm just sitting here as a retired official of a multilateral organization. My own impression is that multilateralism is under great threat for a variety of reasons. It is not just because of this crisis. It has been under threat for some time. I'm very impressed by the compatriot of Dr. Pereira, my former colleague Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, who has had to deal with his tenure has been extremely difficult. I mean, it is not just the WHO which is under threat. WTO is under threat. The WTO is not really able to function. The United States, and it didn't begin with Donald Trump. It began earlier with Mr. Obama. The United States has not agreed to the appointment of judges for the Dispute Settlement Tribunal. So basically, the main role of the WTO in terms of dispute settlement has not been resolved. It is not functioning. The organization is not functioning. That's why I'm not surprised that the current director of the WTO resigned early. It's not over yet, but he resigned early. He gave up in desperation because he's got nothing to show. But it's not his fault. It's not his fault because you have people who are determined to upset well, maybe only one national leader who's determined, but it's the most powerful national leader. And then you have a number of others who, for their own personal purposes, personal and political reasons, are supporting that leader, even though they may not necessarily agree with everything he espouses. And so we have instead of focusing on dealing with this crisis, we have now a lot of finger pointing and inability to cooperate on a number of areas. We need to have as much cooperation as possible, even in the development of the vaccines and making available the treatments, the testing kits, and so on and so forth. I remember when the crisis first began, just a few months ago, we were testing and we were getting results 12 days or 14 days later because we were testing for antibodies.
Yes.
We tested for antigens and we could get results after 6 days. And now we can get results almost immediately. But this virus is very dangerous because, there are many people who are not, who are asymptomatic. There are no symptoms. It's a very, very difficult problem which we have. And even after the development of a vaccine, I hope Dr. Pereira is right, but I seriously fear that there will be an attempt to make profit from it, and this will stand in the way of making available the vaccine to all. This will be very different from the smallpox vaccine, very different from the polio vaccine. I suspect all of us who are speaking today have been vaccinated for polio at least. Maybe the younger generation, maybe not for smallpox because it has been completely eliminated. But things which were public goods, which were common goods. But now we have a situation where every opportunity to make money is being seized upon,
yes,
and often standing in the way of the public interest, standing in the way of the common good.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Pereira, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I totally subscribe what Professor John was saying. I think, unfortunately, we are becoming a bit more inward-looking and a bit more nationalistic. We certainly believe at the OECD it should be the other way around. The answer to the crisis should be more multilateralism and trying to help each other to a global crisis like we haven't faced for a long time. As I said, I think it's going to depend also how long this crisis will last in terms of the virus. And remember, and I'm usually I know that I sound very pessimistic, but I'm very positive, very optimistic type of person usually. But we are talking about unprecedented challenges certainly. But it's very possible, like it happened in 1918. That the virus mutates, and it has two options. Either it mutates to a more benign virus, and it's dangerous, but it could also, in 1918, became a lot nastier in the second wave, right? So, and it killed a lot more people. So I hope this is not the case. Whatever happens, I think it's very important that we find, hopefully, a global solution to the crisis. I think academics are showing partly that the best way forward is exactly that we all put our brains together and try to work out the solution out of this.
Yes.
On another silver lining of the crisis is exactly that scientific community, the academic community in general, has been very cooperative. In fact, even trying to publish papers at a much faster rate than before, because we really want to understand the crisis, analyze the crisis as much as we can, and try to provide solutions to the crisis. So again, if we all follow the good example of the academic world and scientific world, and sharing knowledge is is the way to go, I think we would all benefit. In economic terms, the longer the crisis stays, and the deeper it will become in terms of unemployment and insolvency, I'm afraid that there'll be potentially the temptation to go back to nationalistic, populist type of responses. But as we've seen in this crisis, the countries probably most affected by the crisis are the ones that populist responses were given, and with very dire results. So I think the solution has to be on science and knowledge, and knowledge and science, I think, is the way to go. So not turning more inward looking, but just the opposite.
Interesting. Now we have few more questions here. Another one coming from Professor Dr. Kupran, also from University Utara Malaysia UUM. Maybe this has been discussed before in our conversation earlier, but then he's still asking about what are the policymakers doing in Malaysia that considered as the right medicine for this problem of liquidity and a drop in demand for services. And also, I want to add another question from another professor from University Utara Malaysia, also looking into the employment rate. Prof, is getting higher, and as people are being retrenched, we've talked about this, how people are losing their jobs, due to the constraint of this COVID-19 towards the economy. What do you think the most appropriate measures to overcome the situation of unemployment? Maybe Dr. Pereira, you want to comment on this?
Well, regarding unemployment, there you have two options that, or at least throughout the world, that we've seen two big options, policy responses, basically. One is use what the Europeans call short time work schemes. So basically, people stay in their jobs, and the government pays them 2/3 or full salary, so the companies don't fire people. And you can see this is being done, many OECD countries. In many OECD countries, you have 1/3 of the workforce now being paid by the state. Of course, this is not sustainable because obviously, as an emergency measure, I think it works extremely well. But if the crisis lasts for 2 or 3 years, hopefully not.
Yes.
Many countries will not be able to afford it. So they will move towards more traditional unemployment benefit that we've seen right now. And I think we will also start seeing more a reinforcement of active labor market policies and incentives for firms to hire. Okay. Of course, you have whole chunks of the economy in which this might not be easy, and regions might not be easy. If a country, I'll give an example like Spain, but Malaysia also is in a country that has a big sector like this, tourism. A country like Spain has 40% of their GDP comes from tourism, and certainly you have no tourists or a lot less tourists, and people are afraid of travel, and so on and so on and so on. What do? If this is prolonged for 2 or 3 years? You can help restaurants, and you can help hotels, and you can help people in the hospitality sector for a while, and aviation companies. But if really this stays for a long time, it would be very costly and very difficult to explain how can you maintain these sectors. So I think we are certainly facing very difficult policy responses, including for the unemployment, right? So you will start seeing more and more dedicated packages to fight unemployment and to support people that lose their jobs in, as I said, in sectors like tourism. But if this stays for a long time, this might not be enough. So there might be a temptation to measures towards training, professional training, and vocational training, and so on, so that we recycle some of these workers and provide employment support to other workers for them to either go back to their jobs or try to find other jobs. But I think we'll go back in terms of fighting unemployment. We'll go back to more traditional measures soon enough.
Prof. Jamo, you want to add anything?
Well, I think, as Dr. Pereira emphasized, I think we basically need to try to keep existing employment going, and this has partially been done as far as large enterprises in Malaysia are concerned.
Yes, we have done this here.
That there has been a lot of that. My concern really is with the rest of the economy, particularly, as I have emphasized time and again, the so-called micro enterprises, the family enterprises, all these people who are who are selling goods and so on and so forth. And then you have a fairly serious problem that even the people with incomes are so feeling insecure about there will be a recurrence. So they are spending much less. They are not making major investments, so on and so forth. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Okay, a vicious cycle where even if the credit is available, the credit is not utilized. And the people who are most desperately in need of liquidity often are not able to access that liquidity. I mean, if you have been shut down because of lockdown measures from running your business for 3 months, it's not easy for you to just go back.
Yes, it's not easy.
There are certain obligations to others which you have not been able to discharge or been only able to partially discharge. It's not just possible to resume the economy. So I think it will be extremely difficult. This will be a major challenge, and my concern is that the fact that people are going back to work is good. You have a V, and I don't think it's going to be a W or anything like that. But beyond that initial recovery, how do you sustain it? How do you ensure that there will be enough new activities to ensure sufficient employment? And as some economies, including tourism, for example, some activities are going to be hit so hard that they're going to be able to be reversed in the foreseeable future. So these are very, very difficult questions. There are no easy answers, but unfortunately, we do not have enough of a dialogue, enough consultation. The people who get the ear of policymakers tend to be the people the so-called captains of industry, the people who own the largest corporations, and so forth. The small petty business person, nobody speaks for them. Nobody complains about their plight. The daily rated laborer is often involved in the 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and depressed jobs. Nobody speaks for them. And this is very, very unfortunate. This is not only a problem in Malaysia, it's a problem the world over. And the larger the informal sector, the more likely this is going to be. But I think that the real challenge now is that while we are thinking about creating jobs for those who have lost their jobs or who have much reduced livelihoods now, the big challenge for us is to restore economic activity, to restore livelihoods, but on a different basis, not to simply to revert to the status quo ante, but to become much more forward-looking. And this is extremely important. Every time we have a food problem, we say we're going to go back to 100% price self-sufficiency. And nobody wants to acknowledge that more than 60% of the farmers' incomes in this country are more than 60% subsidized by the government or subsidized by protected prices. So we have to deal with certain realities in this country. We have to deal with the fact that about possibly 1/3 of the workforce in this country consists of foreign workers, and 2/3 of those foreign workers are undocumented. Okay. Now, some of them have left, especially those from Indonesia. Many of them have left because it is possible to catch a boat and go even during the MCO. But even so much of agricultural work, for example, is done by these undocumented foreign workers, and now we are going to have supply problems. Because if you demonize these people, they're not going to come forward. They're going to be hiding until they can leave. And this is a very unhealthy situation. So I think we really need to begin to think about how to deal with these problems. People say, of course, in the short run, a job for a foreign worker may be at the expense of a job for a Malaysian. But if if we do not resume economic activity, there will be no jobs for anybody. This is something which we need to come to terms with, and we need to rebuild the economy on a healthier basis. We need to pay much more attention to problems of food, for example. We have unnecessarily self-inflicted problems of obesity, of diabetes, and a whole range of other infectious diseases, which we can only change if we have better dietary behaviors and so on and so forth. All these problems, this is a time, that's why we need an all-of-government approach, and we need a whole-of-society approach. And this, I think, is the major challenge for all our societies, Malaysian or otherwise.
It seems that it opened up to so much issues and probably that need more discussions on this. Now, there are two questions coming from all the way from Nigeria. One is Dr. Ibrahim Ayuba. I think the question is almost similar to the rest of the other question, because he's asking about how much can be done to earn credibility on policy measures on the common good given our diversity and novelty of the virus. Another coming from Nigeria is from Dr. Abdul Nasir. He also asking about the pandemic is a global one, and he thinks countries are taking independent measures will yield the desired result quickly. And then he was asking to both panelists, don't you think the solution should be in a global scale? I think we have touched on this also, but maybe Prof want to add some more?
Well, I'm not sure what those questions may well have been formulated before our or in the middle of our early discussion. So I'm not sure what to add at this point. Obviously, this is a global problem. This has been underscored many times, but there's no global solution in the sense that many of the most powerful leaders in the world do not want a global solution. Okay, and this is the part of the problem. So we need to begin to work for global solutions. We need to ensure, for example, that vaccines are available, are affordable, and available to all, and so on and so forth. But right now, that leadership is only being provided by the WHO and some governments. There isn't even universal agreement on this.
Yeah, it's true.
Dr. Tedros is being attacked for all kinds of things. The WHO Director General is being attacked on all kinds of things, and instead of focusing on trying to ensure that the right measures are being imposed. Okay, so for example, if we find many of the issues which are being raised now and which are being highlighted and given a lot of attention, especially in the English language media, I'm not so sure about the other languages, are very much over the question of whether there was a conspiracy and things like that. Even if there was a conspiracy, which I do not believe, how does that help us move to a solution earlier? It doesn't. So we are being distracted by the politics of the situation, and unfortunately, the politics of the present situation is hugely problematic. As far as Africa is concerned, as I mentioned earlier, many of the African countries who are the poorest countries, who nobody normally visits, are countries which have been spared the crisis. And some African countries, particularly Senegal, seem to be doing quite well in terms of their early precautionary measures. But I'm not in a position to monitor what is happening in all these countries. So I find it very difficult to address the questions much more fully than that.
Well, I think we have gone more than the time that we have. So I think we're going to end the webinar now, and we want to thank both panel for your ideas, opinions, and you have enlightened us about the issues of COVID-19. And I think it's also make us think more and to do more discussion on these issues. Thank you to all for posting your questions. Some of the questions I can't ask all the questions, so sorry about that. We are unable to attend to all these questions. Do stay on, stay tuned for our coming webinar. We're going to have another webinar by our School of Economic Finance and Banking. Thank you again for Prof. Jomo and also Dr. Para. Very nice to have met Dr. Para. Prof. Jomo is our own economist, so we know how his ideas and also discussions. Thank you again, and everybody, Assalamualaikum and bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Tudo legal.